April the 2nd, 1941. 5:30 in the morning. Mersa el Brega, Libya. The sand was still cool beneath Hauptmann Werner Grün's boots as he surveyed the British positions through his field glasses. Commander of the 3rd Company, 8th Machine Gun Battalion, he had been fighting since Poland. France had fallen before his advance. Now the desert stretched before him, and somewhere beyond those dunes lay the beaten remnants of the British Army. Grün lowered his binoculars and turned to his artillery liaison officer. Through the morning haze, they could see the distinctive silhouettes of British guns, field pieces, the kind his grandfather might have recognized from the last war. "Look at what they're bringing against us," Grün remarked, shaking his head. "Those guns look like museum pieces. The British are fighting a modern war with equipment their fathers used." His words reflected a widespread belief among the Afrika Korps that spring. German intelligence had catalogued the British 25-pounder field gun and deemed it adequate for its intended purpose: supporting infantry, firing high-explosive shells at distant targets, nothing more threatening than any other artillery piece. What German intelligence failed to understand was that British gunners were about to use their museum pieces in ways that would rewrite the rules of desert warfare. Within months, those same guns that Grün dismissed would be firing directly at Panzer columns, their solid steel shot punching through German armor at ranges the Panzers couldn't comprehend. The 25-pounder's story begins not in the scorching sands of North Africa, but in the drafty offices of the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, where a small team of engineers faced an impossible task in 1930. The Great War had taught Britain harsh lessons about artillery. The 18-pounder field gun and the 4.5-inch howitzer had served well enough in the trenches, but both weapons showed their limitations. The 18-pounder fired flat trajectories, excellent for hitting targets you could see, useless for dropping shells behind hills or into trenches. The howitzer could lob shells over obstacles, but lacked the punch for direct engagement. What the Army needed was one gun that could do both jobs, a weapon combining the flat-shooting capability of a field gun with the high-angle fire of a howitzer. Something versatile enough to support advancing infantry, defend fixed positions, and if necessary, take on tanks. The problem was money, or rather, the complete absence of it. Britain in the 1930s was recovering from economic depression. Military budgets were slashed to the bone. The engineers at Woolwich had to design a revolutionary weapon using parts from existing guns, adapting rather than creating from scratch. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. They took the proven carriage of the 18-pounder and modified the barrel to accept a larger shell weighing 25 pounds, hence the name. The result was a gun firing an 87.6mm projectile, nearly 3.5 inches across, larger than the German 75mm field guns, smaller than the American 105mm howitzers, but with a rate of fire that exceeded both. A well-trained crew could fire 10 rounds per minute, 6 to 8 in sustained action. The gun could reach targets over 13,000 yards away using its supercharge. For closer work, crews simply removed propellant bags to reduce range and velocity. 3 cloth bags of propellant, red, white, and blue. Very British. But the truly revolutionary feature was the circular firing platform. Most artillery pieces of the era sat on trails that limited their traverse. Turn them more than a few degrees, and you had to lift the entire gun and reposition it. Time-consuming, exhausting, potentially fatal if enemy tanks were bearing down on your position. The 25-pounder's platform changed everything. The gun sat on a circular metal plate. The crews dropped beneath the wheels when deploying. This platform allowed the weapon to rotate through a full 360 degrees simply by pushing on the trail. One man could spin the gun to face a new target in seconds. Against static targets, this mattered little. Against moving tanks, it meant the difference between life and death. Production began slowly in 1937. By the time war broke out in September 1939, Britain had perhaps 400 of the new guns in service. Most were the early Mark I version, essentially rebored 18-pounders on their original carriages. The proper Mark II guns on purpose-built carriages were only just entering production. Then came Dunkirk. Between the 27th of May and the 4th of June, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated from France. They saved 338,000 men. They left behind virtually all their equipment. Over 725-pounders were abandoned on the beaches and roads of northern France. Britain's field artillery had been gutted. Factories worked around the clock. New guns rolled off production lines in Coventry, Birmingham, and Glasgow. By 1941, the flow had become a flood. Australia and Canada began their own production. The Australians, characteristically, chose to weld their carriages rather than rivet them, making them even stronger. When Rommel's Africa Corps arrived in Libya in February 1941, they found themselves facing an enemy equipped almost entirely with 25-pounders. The German gunners examined captured examples and were unimpressed. The gun lacked the range of their own 105mm pieces. Its shell was lighter. The carriage looked antiquated compared to the split trail designs favored by German artillery. More importantly, German doctrine saw no need for field guns to engage tanks. That was the job of dedicated anti-tank weapons: the 88mm flak gun, the 50mm PaK-38. Proper anti-tank pieces with flat trajectories and armor-piercing ammunition designed specifically for the task. Field artillery existed to support infantry and suppress enemy positions. Nothing more. This fundamental misunderstanding would cost them dearly. The Germans discovered their error outside Tobruk in April 1941. The fortress city had been under siege since the 10th of April, its garrison of Australian and British troops refusing to surrender, despite being cut off from resupply by land. Rommel was furious. Every day Tobruk held out was a day his supplies had to travel an extra 100 miles around the perimeter. Every day was another drain on precious fuel and water. On the 13th of April, the Africa Corps launched its first serious assault on the Tobruk defenses. Elements of the 5th Light Division, including Panzer Regiment 5, pushed toward the southwestern sector. They expected minimal resistance. Their intelligence suggested the garrison was demoralized and poorly equipped. What they found instead was AE Battery, 3rd Regiment, Royal Horse Artillery, positioned behind Cemetery Hill, with their 25-pounders, loaded and waiting. Sergeant William Hartley had been with the battery since Mersa Matruh. 26 years old, son of a Derbyshire coal miner, he had enlisted in '36, hoping the army would offer something better than the pits. Now he crouched behind his gun shield, watching dust clouds approach from the west. German tanks, perhaps 20 of them, coming straight at his position. "Load armor piercing," the troop commander ordered. Hartley's loader slammed a 20-pound solid steel shot into the breech. No explosive filling, just hardened metal designed to punch through armor plate. The shell was new, only recently issued to forward units. Most of the battery's training had been with high explosive rounds for indirect fire. Direct engagement against tanks was something they had practiced exactly twice. The leading Panzer was perhaps 800 yards out when the first gun fired. The crack of the 25-pounder was distinctive, sharper than the German guns. The shot fell short, kicking up a geyser of sand. 600 yards, the gunlayer called out, adjusting his sights. On! The second round struck the Panzer III squarely on the upper hull. At that range, with the supercharged propellant, the muzzle velocity approached 1,700 feet per second. The steel shot punched through the 30mm armor like a fist through cardboard. Smoke erupted from the tank's hatches. Seconds later, flames. What followed was controlled chaos. 8 25-pounders engaging targets that were rapidly closing the distance. The rotating platforms proved their worth. As tanks attempted to outflank the battery, guns spun to track them. Shells flew, armor cracked, tanks burned. After perhaps 15 minutes, the surviving Panzers withdrew. They left 5 of their number burning in the sand. 2 more limped away trailing smoke, their tracks shattered, their crews desperately trying to reach safety. German after-action reports from that engagement make fascinating reading. The commander of Panzer Regiment 5 noted with evident surprise that British field artillery had engaged his tanks directly. He attributed the success partly to the short range and partly to lucky hits on vulnerable spots. The possibility that the 25-pounder was an effective anti-tank weapon was not seriously considered. It should have been. Throughout the siege of Tobruk, which lasted until December 1941, British gunners repeatedly demonstrated what their weapons could do. The 25-pounder couldn't match the legendary 88 in range or hitting power, but it had advantages the German gun lacked. It was lighter, more mobile, and could be deployed faster. A crew could have their gun in action within minutes of arriving at a position. The 88 took much longer and required a level surface. More critically, the 25-pounder was available in numbers the Germans couldn't match. A British infantry division had 72 of them. An armored division had similar numbers. By mid-1941, there were hundreds of 25-pounders in the Western Desert, every one of them capable of knocking out a Panzer at close range. The problem was range. Beyond about 500 yards, the armor-piercing shot lost velocity, and its penetration dropped dramatically. Against the frontal armor of a Panzer IV, the gun was effective only at very close range. German tankers quickly learned to stand off and engage from a distance, using their own guns to silence the British batteries before closing. British gunners needed something better. In late 1941, they got it. The new ammunition arrived with little fanfare, armor-piercing shot with a ballistic cap. The cap was a streamlined nose cone that improved the shell's aerodynamic properties. It did nothing to increase penetration at short range. What it did was maintain velocity over longer distances. Where the original shot lost effectiveness beyond 500 yards, the capped version remained lethal at 800. Even at 1,000 yards, it could penetrate the side armor of most German tanks. Combined with the supercharged propellant introduced in 1943, the 25-pounder became a genuine threat to German armor at ranges previously thought safe. The addition of a muzzle brake allowed the gun to handle the increased recoil. Gunners who had learned their trade firing at distant targets now trained specifically for anti-tank work. The results would be demonstrated spectacularly at Knightsbridge. The position, known as Knightsbridge, was nothing more than a road junction on the Tri Capuzzo, the ancient desert track running from Egypt into Libya. In May 1942, it became the focal point of some of the most desperate fighting the Desert War would see. Rommel had launched his offensive on the 26th of May, sweeping around the southern flank of the British Gazala line. His panzers surged forward, bypassing the fortified boxes the British had established in the desert. By the 27th, German tanks were deep behind British lines, threatening to cut off the forward divisions. The Knightsbridge box was held by the 201st Guards Motor Brigade. Guardsmen. The Brigade of Guards had been mechanized for desert warfare, their battalions mounted in trucks and carriers, but their traditions dated to the 17th century. Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, men whose regiments had stood at Waterloo. On the 12th of June, the situation became critical. German and Italian forces had destroyed the 150th Brigade box to the south. They had overrun British positions at Bir Hakeim. Now they were converging on Knightsbridge from multiple directions. The 4th and 22nd Armored Brigades, attempting to cover the Guards, had been savaged in running battles. British tank strength in the area was down to perhaps 100 operational vehicles. The Germans had more than twice that number. Supporting the Guards were the guns of the 3rd Regiment, Royal Horse Artillery. 24 25-pounders. Against them came the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions. Major Robert Crisp was a tank commander with the 4th Armored Brigade. His memoir describes what he witnessed that morning. The guns of the RHA were firing over open sights at the German tanks as they came in from the west. I watched a 25-pounder crew destroy 3 Panzers in perhaps 90 seconds. The gun layer was tracking the lead tank, firing, then spinning the gun to engage another before the first had even stopped burning. It was the most extraordinary piece of gunnery I ever saw. Bombardier Thomas Fletcher was serving one of those guns, 19 years old, from Barnsley. He had enlisted in 1940, lying about his age to get into the army. Now he was manning a gun that had run out of high-explosive ammunition and was down to its last dozen armor-piercing rounds. We could see them coming through the shimmer, Fletcher recalled in a post-war interview. Like boats on water, the way the heat made them seem to float. Our troop commander was calling ranges, 400 yards, 300. The leading tank was a Panzer IV. Long gun. Dangerous. Our gun layer put a shot right through its turret. It stopped dead. Then another came, and another. The engagement lasted most of the day. German tanks would advance, be driven back by the combined fire of British guns and the remaining tanks, then reform and try again. Each wave came closer. Each wave left more burning vehicles in the sand. By evening, the Guards still held their position. They had lost men, vehicles, and several guns. But they had stopped the German advance cold. Rommel, frustrated, pulled back to consolidate before trying a different approach. The cost had been heavy on both sides. But something had changed in German perceptions. After Knightsbridge, reports began filtering back to higher headquarters that the British 25-pounder was not simply a field gun. It was a weapon system capable of engaging armor with deadly effect. The contempt of April 1941 was giving way to grudging respect. General Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, later wrote of the desert fighting. The British artillery was always their strongest arm. The 25-pounder was a versatile weapon, capable of switching from indirect fire to anti-tank work with remarkable speed. Our tank crews learned to fear those guns almost as much as the 88s they themselves employed. But the greatest demonstration of what the 25-pounder could achieve was yet to come. It would happen on a moonlit night in October, when over 800 British guns opened fire simultaneously, and the Afrika Korps learned the true meaning of artillery supremacy. The 23rd of October, 1942. 21 hours, 40 minutes. El Alamein, Egypt. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery had been planning this moment for months. His 8th Army, reinforced and resupplied, was about to launch the offensive that would break Rommel's Afrika Korps. At the heart of his plan was artillery. More guns than the desert had ever seen. More shells than anyone had thought possible to stockpile. 882 guns were positioned along the 30-mile front. The majority were 25-pounders, 456 of them, arranged in batteries and regiments, their crews waiting for the signal. Behind them, tons of ammunition. In front of them, minefields, wire, and dug-in German and Italian positions. At precisely 21 hours, 40 minutes, the barrage began. Gunner Eric Dobson was serving with the 43rd Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. His gun was one of thousands that opened fire in that first minute. The noise was beyond anything I'd experienced, he wrote to his family after the battle. Not just our gun, but hundreds of them, all firing at once. The ground shook. The air shook. You couldn't hear orders anymore. You just loaded and fired, watching the flames from the muzzle, feeling the gun buck under you. The barrage employed a creeping technique refined from the Great War. Shells fell on the forward German positions first, then the fire shifted gradually backward, allowing infantry to advance behind a curtain of explosions. The precision required was extraordinary. Too slow, and the infantry would be caught in the open. Too fast, and they would run into uncleared enemy positions. Each gun fired according to a meticulously calculated schedule. Red propellant bags for the closer targets. Full charge for the distant ones. The fire control officers juggled ranges and timings, while shells flew overhead and the desert erupted in flame. On the receiving end, German and Italian soldiers experienced something approaching hell. Oberfeldwebel Hans Rechner was with the 164th Light Division. His unit was dug in along the northern sector. When the barrage began, he was in a slit trench, eating what passed for dinner. The first shells came without warning, he testified after being captured. One moment's silence, the next moment the world exploded. Men were screaming. Fires everywhere. We couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't think. It went on and on. Hours. I lost all sense of time. The barrage continued for 5 hours before the infantry assault began. Over 1.5 million shells were fired during the battle. The 25-pounders alone expended hundreds of thousands of rounds. Individual guns fired over 100 shells per day for 12 consecutive days. Barrels wore out and were replaced in the field. Crews worked until exhaustion forced rotation. But the artillery's role went far beyond that opening barrage. Throughout the 13 days of the battle, 25-pounders provided direct support to advancing infantry, broke up German counterattacks, and engaged enemy armor whenever it appeared. The flexible nature of the gun allowed commanders to mass fire on critical points with devastating effect. On the night of the 1st and 2nd of November, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, his final push to break through the Axis lines. The artillery concentration for that attack was even greater than the opening barrage. In the sector held by the 2nd New Zealand Division, guns were positioned at a density of 1 per 21 yards of front. 52 25-pounders per kilometer. German prisoners taken after Supercharge spoke of the psychological impact. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, intelligence officer of the Afrika Korps, later wrote, "The British artillery fire was overwhelming. It fell in a continuous carpet of explosions that made any movement impossible. Our infantry were pinned in their positions, unable to reinforce threatened sectors. When the British tanks finally came, many of our anti-tank guns had already been destroyed." The battle ended on the 11th of November with a decisive British victory. Rommel's army was broken, retreating westward, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and hundreds of destroyed vehicles. Churchill would later say that before Alamein, Britain never had a victory. After Alamein, they never had a defeat. The 25-pounder had proven itself as more than a field gun. It was the backbone of British artillery, a weapon system that combined mobility, accuracy, and sheer volume of fire into something the enemy could not counter. But perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of its capabilities came not in the massive barrages of Alamein, but in a small action a few days earlier, when a single battery faced an entire Panzer regiment and refused to give ground. The 27th of October, 1942. Dawn. Kidney Ridge, El Alamein. The position was actually a depression, not a ridge, but the name stuck from early British mapping. It sat roughly 2 kilometers from the main defensive line, an exposed salient jutting into enemy territory. The British had designated several features in this area as objectives for the ongoing offensive. One of them was codenamed Snipe. The 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, occupied Snipe on the night of the 26th. They brought with them 13 6-pounder anti-tank guns and 6 more from the 239th Battery of the 76th Anti-Tank Regiment. These were proper anti-tank weapons, designed specifically to kill tanks. But supporting them were several 25-pounders from the divisional artillery, positioned to provide indirect fire and, if necessary, direct engagement. What followed became one of the most celebrated actions in British military history. At dawn, the men at Snipe discovered they had inadvertently positioned themselves directly overlooking a German laager. Tanks and vehicles of the 15th and 21st Panzer divisions were spread across the desert below them, crews cooking breakfast, utterly unaware that British anti-tank guns were looking down their throats. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, commanding the battalion, faced a decision. He was surrounded by enemy forces on 3 sides. His position was exposed. Any sensible officer would have withdrawn under cover of darkness. Turner chose to stay and fight. The first German attack came at around 7 in the morning. Panzer IIIs and IVs, advancing without reconnaissance, drove directly toward the British position. The 6-pounders opened fire at optimal range. Tank after tank was hit, stopped, burned. The Germans, shocked by the volume of fire from what they had assumed was empty desert, pulled back. They tried again. And again. Throughout the day, armor from both panzer divisions attacked the Snipe position. Each attack was beaten back with losses. British guns were knocked out, crews killed, ammunition exhausted, and redistributed from disabled weapons. Men fought wounded. Officers took over guns when crews were casualties. Sergeant Charles Calistan of the Rifle Brigade personally destroyed 9 tanks that day. He fired until his gun ran out of ammunition, then helped redistribute rounds from knocked-out positions. When darkness fell and the battalion finally withdrew, Calistan carried a wounded man toward British lines. The man was killed by a stray bullet. Calistan went back for another. The official count credited the defenders of Snipe with destroying 52 to 57 Axis armored vehicles. The actual number may have been higher. When British forces reoccupied the position, they found the wrecks of German and Italian tanks scattered across the desert in every direction. Colonel Turner was awarded the Victoria Cross for his leadership that day. But the story of Snipe is not just about anti-tank guns. The 25-pounders supporting the position provided crucial fire throughout the battle. When German infantry attempted to advance in support of their armor, artillery concentrations broke up the attacks. When Axis guns tried to range on the British position, counter-battery fire forced them to displace. Major Tom Bird, commanding the anti-tank company, later described the coordination. "We couldn't have held without the field guns. Every time Jerry tried to bring up infantry or position his own artillery, the 25-pounders would drop shells on them. It wasn't just about killing tanks. It was about creating conditions where we could kill tanks." The Germans took away a sobering lesson. British combined arms tactics had evolved beyond anything they had faced before. The 25-pounder was no longer simply a field gun. It was the hub of a system that integrated anti-tank defense, infantry support, and counter-battery fire into a seamless whole. By the end of the North African campaign, German respect for British artillery had transformed into something approaching fear. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 12,000 25-pounders were manufactured during the Second World War. They served in every theater: North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Burma, the Pacific. Wherever British and Commonwealth forces fought, the distinctive crack of the 25-pounder was heard. Production came from factories across Britain and the Empire: the Royal Ordnance Factory at Woolwich, the BSA factory in Birmingham, plants in Canada and Australia. At peak output, new guns rolled off production lines at a rate that ensured replacements for any losses and expansion of artillery strength. The ammunition figures are equally impressive: hundreds of millions of shells, high explosive, armor-piercing, smoke, star shells for illumination, propaganda rounds loaded with leaflets, chemical shells that were manufactured, but fortunately never used. But statistics cannot capture what the gun meant to the men who served it and those who depended on its fire. Gunner William Patterson served with the 51st Highland Division from Alamein to Germany. His letters home preserved by his family, described the bond between artillery and infantry. "The infantry lads know we're behind them," Patterson wrote in November 1942. "When they're pinned down, when Jerry's machine guns have them stuck, they call for artillery. And we answer. We can't see the targets most of the time, just map references and corrections from the observers. But we know we're helping. When the shooting stops and the infantry advance, we did that." On the receiving end, German soldiers developed their own perspective. Gefreiter Klaus Brenner was captured in Tunisia in May 1943. His interrogation report, preserved in British archives, contains extensive comments on British artillery. "The 25-pounder is a good weapon, very fast. The crews are well trained. They can switch targets quickly. Our officers said it was not as good as our 105, but I think they were wrong. The British shells fell everywhere, all the time. You could not move without shells falling." The gun's versatility was key to its effectiveness. The same weapon that provided creeping barrages for infantry attacks could switch to anti-tank fire when panzers appeared. The same crews who spent hours firing at map coordinates could engage targets over open sights when the situation demanded. This flexibility meant commanders had options that their German counterparts lacked. Brigadier Sidney Ninham, commanding the 4th Armored Brigade's artillery in 1942, explained the tactical thinking in a post-war lecture. "We used our 25-pounders for everything: counter-battery, counter-tank, harassing fire on supply routes, smoke to cover movement. The Germans had specialized weapons for each task. We had one gun that could do it all, perhaps not as well as the specialist, but well enough. And we had hundreds of them. The cost of this versatility was human. Artillery crews faced dangers different from infantry, but no less real. Counter-battery fire sought them out. Aircraft strafed gun positions. Tank attacks overran batteries that stood their ground too long. The casualty rolls of Royal Artillery regiments from the Desert Campaign list: hundreds of gunners killed, wounded, or captured. Bombardier James Crawford was killed at Knightsbridge on the 13th of June, 1942. His battery commander's letter to his family described how Crawford had continued to serve his gun after being wounded, refusing evacuation until a direct hit destroyed the weapon and killed its crew. Sergeant Robert Miller survived the siege of Tobruk, but lost his leg to a shell fragment at Alamein. He spent 18 months in hospital before being discharged. His daughter later discovered his diary, hidden in a chest for decades. One entry reads simply, "We held the line today. That's all that matters." These men transformed an obsolete field gun into a weapon system that helped win the war in North Africa. The 25-pounder remained in British service until 1967. Over 2 decades after the Second World War ended, gunners were still training on the same basic weapon that had shattered Rommel's panzers. The gun saw action in Korea with British and Commonwealth forces, in Malaya during the emergency, in various small wars and colonial conflicts where its reliability and effectiveness continued to prove valuable. Other nations adopted it too. The 25-pounder equipped Greek, Dutch, Belgian, and Free French units during the war. After 1945, it spread further. Pakistan still manufactures ammunition for the weapon. Ireland kept their guns in ceremonial service until recently. But the true legacy lies not in the weapon itself, but in what it proved. German military thinking before the war emphasized specialization. Dedicated anti-tank guns, dedicated field artillery, dedicated anti-aircraft weapons, each optimized for its specific role, each requiring specialized crews and ammunition. British thinking went a different direction. One versatile weapon, serving multiple purposes. Crews trained in all roles. Ammunition designed for flexibility. The 25-pounder embodied this philosophy. When German tanks came, the gun fired armor-piercing shot. When infantry needed support, it fired high explosive. When commanders needed smoke or illumination, those shells were available too. This flexibility meant that British commanders could concentrate artillery on critical points without worrying about whether they had the right type of gun for the task. The German approach had its advantages. Their 88mm gun was a better anti-tank weapon than the 25-pounder would ever be. Their 105mm howitzers fired heavier shells to longer ranges. But these advantages came at a cost in complexity and logistics. A German division needed multiple types of artillery ammunition. Different calibers, different types, different supply chains. A British division needed primarily 25-pounder ammunition, supplemented by a few other calibers for specialized weapons. When supply lines stretched and logistics became strained, this simplicity mattered. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this better than most German commanders. His memoirs contain repeated references to British artillery superiority, not in quality of individual weapons, but in volume of fire and flexibility of employment. The British artillery was handled with great skill, Rommel wrote. They concentrated their fire with remarkable speed, shifting from target to target as the situation demanded. Our forces frequently found themselves under overwhelming fire before they could deploy properly. The 25-pounder, while not remarkable on its own, became devastating when employed in mass. This was perhaps the gun's greatest achievement. It was never the best at anything, not the most powerful, not the longest ranged, not the most accurate. But it was good enough at everything, and that was enough. The men who served the 25-pounder understood this. They knew their gun couldn't match the 88 in a straight duel. They didn't try. Instead, they used their weapons' strengths, speed of deployment, rate of fire, the rotating platform that let them engage targets from any direction, flexibility that let them switch roles as the battle demanded. Hauptmann Werner Grün, the German officer who dismissed British artillery as museum pieces in April 1941, survived the Desert War. He was captured in Tunisia in May 1943. His interrogation report notes that he had revised his opinion of British weapons considerably. "The 25-pounder is a good field gun," he admitted. "Better than we expected. Their crews are very fast. They can put rounds on target before you have time to react. Our intelligence told us it was obsolete. Our intelligence was wrong." The guns that Grün dismissed as relics of an earlier age had broken the Afrika Korps. They had shattered Panzer columns at Knightsbridge and Alamein. They had provided the fire support that allowed British infantry to advance through minefields and barbed wire. They had proven that versatility and volume could overcome specialization and quality. When the last British 25-pounder was retired from active service in 1967, it marked the end of an era. But the lessons it taught endured. Flexibility, simplicity, volume of fire, the ability to mass effects on critical points. The German tanks that mocked Britain's old 25-pounder in 1941 were burning wrecks by 1943. Their crews, those who survived, learned a painful lesson. Never underestimate a weapon just because it looks outdated. Never assume the enemy doesn't know what they're doing. And never, ever drive a tank within range of a 25-pounder battery that's ready and waiting. The thunder they brought down changed the Desert War. It helped turn the tide against Rommel's Afrika Korps. It demonstrated that British ingenuity and determination could overcome German technology and tactics. Those guns were never museum pieces. They were the most versatile field artillery weapons of the Second World War, and the men who served them helped save Britain from defeat. The German tankers who survived learned to respect the 25-pounder. Those who didn't respect it didn't survive. That is the legacy of thunder in the desert. That is the story of Britain's most underrated weapon, and the men who proved its worth in fire and steel. The sands of North Africa still hold the rusted remnants of Panzers destroyed by 25-pounder fire. They stand as monuments to a gun that was supposed to be obsolete, to crews who were supposed to be outclassed, and to a military doctrine that proved superior when it mattered most. The Germans stopped laughing at the 25-pounder sometime around Knightsbridge. By Alamein, they weren't laughing at all. They were running, and the guns followed them all the way to Tunisia, and beyond, to victory.